This presentation introduces the activity of defining requirements, which is about eliciting and formulating requirements in design research. Defining requirements is in many ways similar to explicating a problem. When you explicate a problem, you start from the participants in a practice. You analyze the problems they perceive, their goals, their needs, and wants. In a requirements definition, you continue this analysis and this activity. But here you do it relative to some artifact. You have an artifact in mind when you define the requirements. Here's an example. Suppose we have a problem or a need. We need protection from viruses. This is a part of problem explication. This one doesn't say anything about any particular artifact. Then we can continue this analysis, but now we have some specific artifacts in mind, namely a respirator. And we formulate the respirator should filter the air from at least 95% of all viruses. This is a requirement because it is formulated relative to this respirator artifact. So in this way, problem explication and requirements definition are quite similar to each other, and requirements definition can be seen as a continuation of the problem explication. Here is a definition of the word requirement. A requirement is a property of an artifact that is needed or wanted or desired by stakeholders in a practice, and this requirement is to be used for guiding the design and development of this artifact. And here are some examples of requirements for user interface. It's about response time and feedback and what the user should be allowed to do. According to this definition, a requirement is a property that someone wants an artifact to possess. So what counts as a requirement? It depends on actors and on the intention of actors and on the power of actors. Who can decide which properties that should become requirements and who has the power to do so? Typically, it's the person or organization that orders the artifact that has this power, but often many other actors can also influence the requirements, as exemplified in this list. Define requirements can be seen as a sub-process within the entire design research process, and we'll start with an overview of this sub-process. The input to the define requirements activity is an explicated problem, which is an output from the explicate problem activity. In order to define your requirements, you need to have a good understanding of your problem. You need to define your problem precisely and sometimes also to identify its root causes. When this is done, you have a sufficient understanding for finding requirements. Here is the question to answer in this activity. What artifact can be a solution for the explicated problem, and which requirements on this artifact are important for the stakeholders? This question is twofold. It's both about an artifact that can be a solution, and it is about the requirements that can be formulated for this artifact. This is reflected in the sub-activities within the defined requirements sub-process. It's both about outlining an artifact and defining requirements on it. The first sub-activity is outline artifact or sketching the artifact, and here you should choose a relevant artifact type and then describe the artifact in broad overview. Choosing an artifact type will set boundaries for what artifact is going to be designed and developed. When you choose the artifact type, you will start from some artifact classification, for example V1 that classified artifacts into constructs, models, methods, or instantiations. But you can also use some other artifact classification, for example the more pragmatic one shown here to the right. Here is an example of choosing artifact type. Suppose we have this problem that many IT systems are isolated, unable to communicate with each other. This causes extra costs for transferring information manually between the systems, and it gives also rise to reduced benefits of using the systems. Then, very different artifact types can be used to address this problem. You could develop a method for integrating IT systems, or a model of an integration architecture, or an instantiation in the form of an integration tool. And dependent on the type of artifact that you choose, very different artifacts will then be designed and developed. Here is a small exercise. Please read this problem before you move on and propose at least 5 artifacts of the different types that can address this problem. After having chosen the artifact type, it's time to describe the artifact in broad overview. This description should be brief and simple, only a few lines, and focusing on the artifact's overall structure and main functions. It could look like this: a face mask consisting of 4 layers of filters and a valve, protecting the wearer against both dust and biological material. And the description can be just as simple and as brief as this one. You don't need to include a lot of detail. In fact, it's recommended not to provide too much detail, as this might hamper creativity in later stages. When an artifact has been outlined, it's possible to start eliciting requirements. And the 3 main ways of doing so is to consult the literature, engage with stakeholders, and to investigate existing artifacts. To consult the literature means here to read literature about the practice and the problem under consideration, and in particular about existing suggestions for requirements that have been documented in the literature. And this literature, it could be academic, for example from journals and conference proceedings, but it could also be practice-oriented literature, such as white papers and trade press. Another way to elicit requirements is to engage with stakeholders in relevant practices. The most straightforward way of doing this is to ask stakeholders about the requirements they would like to suggest, for example in interviews or in focus groups. But you could also go a bit broader and ask them about their interests and opinions. Furthermore, you can also observe the stakeholders as they carry out their activities in their practices. One point here is that it is important to identify the right groups of stakeholders to learn from. So you make sure not only to consider one single group. For example, if you're going to develop an artifact, say an IT system in an organization, you shouldn't only learn from the managers, but also from other stakeholders such as employees and customers, and maybe also from shareholders and government or authorities. Yet another way of listing requirements is to investigate existing artifacts. For example, you can read manuals of artifacts that are similar to the one to be designed and developed. or you can read reviews or user comments about such artifacts. Still another way is to do some reverse engineering. In that case, you start with an existing completed artifact, for example, some physical object. You decompose it, you look into its inner structure, and from that you try to derive models, drawings, architectures behind it, and from those you can derive requirements. When eliciting requirements, it's often helpful to make use of some methods that support you in this activity. Such methods can be based on research methods, for example, surveys or case studies, interviews, questionnaires, focus groups, document analysis, and so on. But these methods for requirements elicitation, they can also be based on more practice-based approaches, such as brainstorming or role-playing or prototyping.